When thinking about the Dust Bowl, you would normally think about the 1930s. Yet the problem really started in the first 3 decades of the 20th century. The government lured farmers west by promising them 160 acres to anyone who could homestead on it. There was greater demand for wheat brought on by World War I. There was plentiful rain, and farmers were producing more than they ever had before. They plowed up all of the sod and planted crops. These crops did not have the hardiness of the native prairie grasses to withstand a drought, and when the rains stopped in 1930, the crops withered and died, leaving nothing but a bare landscape, and the wind just blew the dirt all the time. At the time, there was nothing above the landscape except for a house here and there. The Great Plains were vast and open. And the government tried to do something to combat this. They started planting shelter belts. They bought up land that should not have been cultivated and required farmers to use sustainable grazing practices. However, the drought of the 1930s was not the worst drought we've ever had. There have been worse droughts in the 1950s, in 1977, and the latest in 2012. So why weren't the conditions as bad as in the 1930s? Technological advancements and conservation practices put into place during the dirty 30s have saved us from another Dust Bowl. In 1933, Congress created the Soil Conservation Service. Most farms were small, and farmers were either unwilling or unable to afford to implement conservative farming practices. And even if one farmer did implement these practices, if the ones around him didn't, it was almost pointless. The Soil Conservation Service used emergency funding to help these farmers implement these practices. The government did more. As I stated before, they planted shelter belts and they bought up ground that was not suited for crops. The efforts made by the government were successful, and by 1938, 65% of the blowing dirt had stopped. Terracing, contour plowing, and crop rotation saved farmers from further devastation. By leaving strips of plants with dense soil-holding roots, it slowed the rain from running down the hill and saved topsoil. Contour plowing, or plowing with the curve of the land rather than plowing it straight up and down, also created ridges, also slowing down the water, and it kept the topsoil in place. The government provided incentives for farmers to plant certain crops, like legumes, which return nitrogen to the soil. The first step by farmers was to get through the Depression. If they could do that, they could prepare for the next drought. And they didn't have long to prepare either, because the next drought came just 10 years later in the 1950s. But by the 1950s, farmers had begun irrigating to compensate for the lack of moisture. They put into place some of these conservation methods suggested by the government during the 1930s, and they didn't see near the damage. From the 50s to the 70s, many farms consolidated, making it easier yet to implement these practices. The invention of no-till farming further preserved the soil by planting directly into the previous year's crops remains. Crops have also been bred to be more drought tolerant. Today, we are on the verge of another Dust Bowl, and if we are not careful, we could have one very easily. A field not far away from my house was just smooth last fall, and on days with high winds, the soil on that field blows, and from less than a half mile away, you can't see through it. We also dished a field last fall, and there's several others in the area, but they left some of the trash from last year's crop, and that little bit that they left is saving the soil. Grassland is being plowed up in areas that aren't suitable for crops. If we would have another major drought, these areas could create massive dust storms, like that field not far away from my house. Farmers today use various methods of conservation and drought protection. Many farmers like to work their soil to create a smooth seed bed for their crops, which is fine if it's done in the spring, right before it's planted, or if they leave some trash on the field during the fall to keep it from blowing away. They use no-till farming and fertilize to replenish the soil each year. Shelter belts help to slow the wind. Technological advancements in the hybrids of crops play a huge role in preventing another Dust Bowl. In 2012, if it weren't for these technological advancements, it would have been even more horrible than it was. Those crops withstood better than they even did in the 70s, which was 30 years earlier. It's amazing what we have done. Government programs like CRP have also provided incentives to farmers to plant land to grass. It has been many years since the dirty 30s, but if we're not careful, we could have another Dust Bowl. Farmers need to continue using conservative farming practices. Crops have been record-breaking over the last few years. With the expanding world population, we need to keep moving forward in the world of farming because we cannot afford to take a step back.